Good morning, and welcome to the keynote address for the 37th Annual Frank Church Conference on How Democracies Survive and Thrive in the 21st Century, sponsored by the Frank Church Institute at Boise State University. My name is Garry Wenske, and I am the Executive Director of the Frank Church Institute in the School of Public Service. The Institute was established to honor the achievements and to carry forward the principles of Senator Frank Church. He delivered the first lecture on War or Peace, the American Role at Boise State University in 1982. Given today's challenges to democracies around the world, conversations like these are even more important. On behalf of the Frank Church Institute Board of Directors, our thanks to Oppenheimer Companies, C. Frederick Cornforth, and Community Development, Inc. for underwriting this series on Fridays with Frank. Thanks also to Gregory Caslow and Kay Hardy, and to Parsons, Behle, and Latimer for sponsoring the conference. Joining the discussion with today's keynote speaker is Chris Burke, a member of Parsons, Behle, and Latimer law firm. Chris, who served on Senator Church's staff, is also a member of the board of the Frank Church Institute, where he is the treasurer. Welcome to both of you, and let's begin with Chris.
Thank you, Garry, and good morning to everyone who's joining us for this second session of the 37th Annual Frank Church Conference. I hope many of you were able to join us this morning for an excellent panel discussion on Hungary, a case study in democracy. It is my great pleasure today to be the one to introduce our featured speaker for this conference, Dr. Larry Diamond. On a personal note, I must say I met Larry about a year ago. It was after midnight at the Saigon Ho Chi Minh Airport in Vietnam, and we had both been traveling for almost 24 hours. We shared a ride to our hotel, and we spent every day together for the next 3 weeks, traveling around 4 countries in Southeast Asia. And it was during that time that I had the privilege of watching Larry give a series of 5 lectures on the political, socio-economic, and cultural issues of the 4 countries we were traveling in, as well as the dramatic influence of China on the region. And it was in those conferences in those lectures that I determined that Larry was really good at this. His lectures were informative, he was insightful, and what I really appreciated was how great he was at answering questions. So I decided then and there that I wanted to ask him to join us as a speaker at this conference, and I did that before we both got on a plane and went back to the States. And he graciously and without equivocation agreed. And we are very lucky to have him. Dr. Larry Diamond is a professor of sociology and political science at Stanford University. And he is one of the world's leading scholars and experts on democracy and democratic studies. He's a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford, which is a think tank on public policy. He's a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford. That's its main research center for international issues. He earned his bachelor's, master's, and a PhD at Stanford. He was a founding co-director of the National Endowment for Democracy's International Forum for Democratic Studies. He was the founding co-editor of that endowment's publication, which is entitled Journal of Democracy. He is currently the director for the Center on Democracy, Development, and Rule of Law, and a coordinator of the Hoover Institution's Iran Democracy Project. He has at various times served as advisors for numerous government and international organizations, and including the UN, the United Nations, the U.S. State Department, the World Bank, and the Agency for International Development. He's written prolifically on the subject of democracies. both our own and those around the world, and what makes democracies tick. His most recent book, which he published in 2019, is entitled Ill Winds, Saving Democracy from Russian Rage, Chinese Ambition, and American Complacency. I've got a copy of the book here. That book could very well be the poster child for this Frank Church Conference theme, which is how democracies survive and thrive in the 21st century. It's extremely well written, meticulously researched, and what I find most interesting is it has very practical, common sense suggestions for how we can bolster and strengthen our democracies. I might also add that it's an easy read. Is one of the recommended readings for this conference on the Frank Church Institute Fridays with Frank website at Boise State University. And it was, in fact, this past week, the subject of Dr. Diamond's radio interview with former BSU president Bob Kustra on his regular Reader's Corner program. So I would highly recommend to everyone this book if you haven't already read it. I would also recommend several other recent articles published by Dr. Diamond within the last 3 weeks, but before and after the election. These are also highlighted and recommended for this conference on the Frank Church Institute Fridays with Frank website. So it is my great honor and pleasure to introduce to you the keynote speaker for this 37th annual Frank Church Conference, Dr. Larry Diamond.
Well, thank you, Chris, for your extremely generous introduction. And thank you, Garry, as well, for your invitation, and to the entire team of the Frank Church Institute and this great program, Fridays with Frank at Boise State. You know, I didn't know the senator, Chris, like you did. I certainly didn't work for him, but I do vividly remember his leadership on issues of human rights and democracy, freedom and accountability at home and abroad during a distinguished career in the United States Senate. And I will just say that this great third wave of global democratization began in the mid-1970s, in part because of pressure from the United States Congress to have an American foreign policy that was more respectful of human rights. And of course, it's very important to recall that Frank Church was really a major leader in that. With that introduction, I'm now going to share my screen and begin this lecture. Before we can understand how democracies thrive, we have to understand why they've been decaying and breaking down during the last 15 years in particular. So I apologize, but a lot of this lecture is necessarily going to deal with some harsh realities. I want to begin by saying that democracy, we must think of, I think it's very important to think of it in the current context for our own democracy, as sitting on three stools. Because obviously, as Americans steeped in the Bill of Rights and concepts of checks and balances and limited government, it isn't just democracy in the pure electoral sense of majority rule that we aspire for. It's a liberal democracy that also protects minority rights and individual liberties, the liberal element of liberal democracy, and a republic in which there's a rule of law and a vast interlocking system of checks and balances, which we call now in political science horizontal accountability. So let's bear that in mind. A liberal democracy is the package of the three. Here you see at the end of 2019 a portrait of the state of democracy around the world. The blue bar indicates what percentage of states in each of these regions are electoral democracies, and the orange bar indicates what percentage meet the higher standard in addition of liberal democracy, with reasonably good performance on all three of those standards I just mentioned to you. And of course, Western Europe and the Anglophone states of the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they're all liberal democracies. So are most of the tiny Pacific Island states. In Central and Eastern Europe, you see the beginning of the step pattern downward. Most of the former communist states of Central and Eastern Europe are democracies, but only about 60% of them are liberal democracies. And Hungary is gone. Poland is headed in the decidedly wrong and scary direction. The Czech Republic has been under a lot of pressure too. Bulgaria is constantly, a struggle to achieve liberal democracy. So you see the problem, and then you go to Latin America and the Caribbean, and we've lost democracy in Venezuela and Nicaragua. There was a breakdown last year in Bolivia. It's trying to come back now. Peru is in crisis. And with every step out to a wider array geographically in Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, and so on, you see a smaller percentage of democracies and a much smaller percentage of liberal democracies. And if you look at that, those numbers to the right, you see that this represents, in Latin America and the Caribbean, in Asia and Africa, significant erosion from where we were just 7 or 8 years ago. So what's been happening? In this slide, you see again, the blue indicates the trend now for electoral democracy, the orange for liberal democracy. This just depicts countries over 1 million population. And you can see that there was a gradual ascent of democracy, the percentage of states over 1 million people that are democracies, the blue line, beginning in 1974, when this congressional pressure for more US respect for human rights was beginning to take effect. And in addition, we had the Watergate crisis, the resignation of Richard Nixon, and in addition, we had the Portuguese Revolution of April 1974, starting this very dramatic period. This progress was gradual, of course, most of you know, until the fall of the Berlin Wall, when you see this dramatic jump from only around 40% of countries in the world being democratic to, for the first time in the history of the world, a majority of states being democracies. And this peaked around 2006 with 57% of the states over 1 million population meeting a minimum standard of electoral democracy. It was well over 60% of all the states in the world. And then you see the global democratic recession, that for the last 12 years, we've been headed downward. And last year was the first year since the end of the Cold War when a majority of the states over 1 million population were not electoral democracies. And this shows you the rising pace of democratic breakdowns. We can divide this 44-year period of the third wave of global democratization into 4 periods. And in the first one, from the mid-70s to the mid-80s, 1 in 7 democracies in the world broke down. This declined in the next 2 11-year periods to about 1 in 9 democracies, a little less than 11%. And in the most recent period, going through the end of last year, we've had nearly 1 in 5 democracies breaking down. And we see that the rate of transition to democracy among all the authoritarian regimes of the world has been declining. Almost half of the authoritarian regimes in the world broke down and gave way to democracy between 1987 and 1997, with the demise of Eastern European communism and then the Soviet Union. That rate fell only to about a quarter in the following 11-year period, and it was down to 18% more recently. And so we have, this slide, which I think is very telling. This tells you the ratio of countries making transitions to democracy in each 5-year period compared to the ones making transitions away from democracy to authoritarian rule. And you see that the last 5 years, through the end of last year, were the first 5-year period, again, since the beginning of the third wave, the first 5-year period where this balance was negative. And it had already kind of leveled off in the previous 5 years. So this is something to be very concerned about. Then you have this classic slide, which comes from the data of Freedom House, which, keep in mind, is assessing all the countries in the world every year in terms of their political rights and civil liberties. So most countries in a given year don't change their levels of political rights and civil liberties, even on the fairly fine-grained 100-point scale that Freedom House has. But we can look and see how many countries have improved either on political rights, such as to contest in free and fair elections, or civil liberties, or both, and compare that to the number of countries that have declined. You can see that after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, in most years, for about 15 years, this balance was very favorable. Typically, it was 1.5, 2 times as many. In a number of years, you see here 2.5 times as many countries gaining in freedom as declining. Since 2007, when the democratic recession really took hold, only between 50% and 70% as many countries gained in freedom in a given year, a number that declined. And there have been some big decliners here during this period. You can see the last 7 years. So this slide shows you the countries that lost the most ground on the 100-point scale of political rights and civil liberties over the period 2012 through the end of 2019. And of course, we all know Turkey has become a hard authoritarian regime. Venezuela under this mirage of Bolivarian socialism. Hungary under Viktor Orban. Poland, I've told you, is slipping backwards. That the United States should be next with Russia and Kenya in terms of the ground lost during this period, I think is something that we all, as citizens of what we would like to believe to be the greatest democracy in the world, should worry about. This next slide compares the trajectory in the United States with that in many of our peer democracies in Europe, Canada, and Japan. And again, we're looking at the Freedom House 100-point scale of political rights and civil liberties. And you can see here that back in 2005, 6, 7, and 8, the US was near the middle of the pack, not as good as Germany and Sweden and the United Kingdom, but pretty good with a score of 94 out of 100. And then you see this gradual descent of the quality of democracy in the United States. And I do want to say, for those of you who are thinking two words to explain this, Donald and Trump, to please note that this decline began well before the election of Donald Trump to the presidency. Of course, it was accelerated after, and had a lot to do with the severe political polarization in the United States, the dysfunction of the United States Congress as a result of that. And I would argue now, to my mind, with considerable alarm, as a result of what's been happening in recent weeks, the deterioration of our democratic culture. And you should also be aware of the fact that another independent evaluation effort that annually rates the level of democracy in all countries of the world, that is the Democracy Index of The Economist magazine, or more specifically, the Economist Intelligence Unit. This exercise downgraded the United States to the status of a flawed democracy beginning about 3 years ago. So to summarize what's been happening here, one of the things that worries me is that every category of regime has been deteriorating during this now nearly 15-year period of democratic recession globally, but particularly in the last 5, 7, 8 years. The liberal democracies have been becoming less liberal. I showed you the US. It's a dramatic trend downward in Poland, where democracy is really under pressure. In Brazil, where a right-wing populist who has expressed open admiration for the Brazilian military dictatorship of the 70s and 80s, Jair Bolsonaro is now the elected president of the country. Then we have the illiberal democracies that have nevertheless been successful electoral democracies until recently. And you can see how many of these have broken down, including in the Philippines, Peru under pressure, Nicaragua, Honduras, Bangladesh, Thailand, a once very hopeful and vibrant democracy, Turkey, the same. Then we have the category of what we call in political science competitive authoritarian regimes. These are countries that don't have democracy, don't have free and fair elections, but allowed quite a significant degree of electoral competition, opposition presence in parliament, independent newspapers, civil society to operate and protest. And you see here that these have been disappearing altogether. Chris mentioned that we were together in Southeast Asia. Cambodia is one of the countries we visited. Hun Sen just had parliamentary elections recently again, and he figured, what the heck? Why tolerate opposition in parliament or even a gesture at free and fair elections? The US isn't doing anything. Nobody's complaining. If anybody starts breathing down my neck, I'll threaten to just throw in my lot even more completely with the People's Republic of China if they don't leave me alone. So greedy as he is, he claimed every single parliamentary seat for his Cambodian People's Party. And then the authoritarian regimes that didn't gesture at competition and pluralism are gesturing even less now. So what's been going on is what I call creeping authoritarianism. And the principal mechanism of this has been the mode of illiberal populism, We see, I've made reference to many of these people: Orban, the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Bangladeshi prime minister, Sheikh Hasina, another right-wing, vulgar, illiberal autocrat, Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. Now we have the Mongolian president. It's not really a presidential system, it's more of a parliamentary one. But this man, Batulga, the longtime president of the Mongolian Judo Association, is not a liberal influence in the country. And if you're looking over the horizon at what you should be worried about, I think one of the principal threats now that we all should be worried about is that the largest democracy in the world, 1.3 billion people, the place we point to as an alternative to the People's Republic of China, an immensely important partner for the United States in trying to balance against the expansion of China's malign military and political influence in the world. India is on a downward slide toward authoritarianism under this extremely skillful but illiberal populist Narendra Modi and his BJP party. So you hear a lot about this word populism. What does populism mean? Well, you know, in the most basic sense, and this is how it's been used in American history, it's just that it's anti-elitist. Leaders who rise up, claim to be the voice of the people, and condemn corrupt established elites who've been abusing the real interests of the people. And, you know, if that's all it was, populism might not be such a bad thing. We do have elitism. It veers into corruption. Elites sometimes need a good kick in the pants to become more responsive to the popular will. And of course, a dose of agrarian populism brought about a lot of political reform in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. But today's populism has a number of other elements that are very dangerous to democracy. One is that they are anti-pluralist. Now, what is pluralism? Pluralism means a multiplicity of interests, actors, and political tendencies, and crucially, a respect for the need of that multiplicity and that divergence in a healthy democracy. Populists, by contrast, say, we have the answer. Those other people, they don't represent the real, true, deserving people. And so when you get into a hostility to pluralism, it's a very slippery slope downward toward hegemony, toward presenting yourself, your party, your group as the only legitimate political actor, and everybody else as an imposter or a traitor or undeserving of a place in the system. And if that's the way you think, you know, it's not a very long step downward further to believing that it's okay to disqualify large numbers of votes because they weren't from the real deserving good people of the country. Populists are anti-institutionalist. They have an acute distrust of the existing institutions, and particularly once their leader is in power, of institutions that would check and monitor the leader and disperse power. The populist view of democracy, to the extent that they democracy survives at all under populism is plebiscitary. Now, that's a fancy word for saying that they think an election is a plebiscite, and it gives a leader and a party the power to rule absolutely. And once that is vested in the populist leader, there should be no further checks or constraints. And this is particularly dangerous because part of the populist package is intolerance of religious, ethnic, and political and other minorities. So, you know, if you have this combination of anti-pluralism, hegemonic tendencies, contempt for checks and balances, and indeed courts and the rule of law, and then in addition, prejudice against religious, ethnic, and other minorities, it's a very dangerous thing. Lay on that an ultra-nationalist hostility toward outsiders and the forces of globalization, not that those forces are an unmitigated good. And you've got the kind of dangerous package that's been challenging democracy. And the way that these illiberal populists challenge and ultimately tear down or contradict democracy is through what I call the autocrat's 12-step program, which I detail in my book that Chris kindly mentioned to you, Ill Winds. These actors begin by demonizing and delegitimizing the political opposition. Go back to the previous slide, as not really true deserving people. Then once they're in power, it's off to the races. And they go about trying to discredit the existing judges and courts, undermine their independence, and stuff the courts with politically loyal judges and induce others to resign. They undermine the independence of the media, often getting their powerful business partners to buy up opposition or critical newspapers and television stations. And if people don't want to sell, you know, these illiberal populists have a very straightforward strategy toward persuading them to divest themselves of their media enterprises that are critical of the new ruling party. They, like the mafia, make them an offer they can't refuse. Well, you know, you can sell, you can join the party and start praising us rather than criticizing us. And if you don't want to do either of those, you know, we control the tax authorities, we control the prosecution. One way or another, you're going to wind up in jail. And this is what's happened in Venezuela, in Turkey, in Hungary, and lots of others of these countries. Once independent media is cowed, you also go after public broadcasting, you constrain internet freedom, and you go after threatening and subduing civil society. You prosecute people like myself in the university who might be critical of the ruling rights organizations. You make sure that the Bar Association is going to be an instrument of your political project. You intimidate the broader business community into submitting to your will and becoming part of your political wave. And then the ones who are really willing to become your slavish followers, you make very, very rich through the provision of state contracts and all sorts of other licenses and monopolies. Then you go to work on the last two elements of resistance to this hegemony and ultimately authoritarianism. You start purging the civil service of people who believe it should be independent of politics and the security services. you bend them to your will, you bring them to heel, and ultimately you take over electoral administration so you can count the votes in the proper way and not in any kind of independent way. Once you've done that, you repeat steps 1 to 11 again, and then there's nothing left of democracy. And that is what has happened in Turkey, in Hungary, in Venezuela, and so on. I want to wrap up in a few minutes, so I don't want to dwell on this slide. I think you know that things have been getting worse during the COVID-19 pandemic as a variety of authoritarian regimes have been using the pandemic as an excuse to heighten news censorship, to arrest opponents, to strike fear in people, to ban freedom of movement and assembly, even to remove term limits on the president in Russia. So why has this been happening? Well, generally, democracies have been breaking down when they were weak anyway, when they were illiberal anyway, although that wasn't the case in Hungary. It had been a liberal democracy. And you see that weak rule of law, executive aggrandizement of power, go hand in hand with one another. The first enables the second. Then the curse of our time, it's not only in the United States, it's amazingly pervasive around the world. I was just in a conference yesterday on South Korea where they were lamenting the same thing we're struggling with in the United States, severe political polarization and distrust, a kind of tribal loyalty to party over country. Where political institutions are weak anyway, this just further facilitates the phenomena. Poor economic performance is usually an element here, but not always. Some democracies have been breaking down even when the economy's been doing pretty well. But the bottom line is that people get turned against one another. They come to be very cynical about their political institutions and the entire existing class of political leaders. Democracy loses legitimacy, and that paves the way for a strong man. Then we've got a variety of international causes of this democratic malaise and recession. Some of them have to do with the fact that the power balance in the world has been changing in the last decade. As the US has been preoccupied with domestic crises, remember first the severe financial crisis that befell the United States in 2008. And we were only beginning to climb out of that when, at the end of the Obama presidency, and then of course, we had the election of a classic illiberal populist in the United States. And a further pulling back, it didn't start under President Trump, but it accelerated under him, a further pulling back of forthright, vigorous American efforts to promote democracy around the world. Of course, it's a tough challenge. We've got a lot of other things we need to do in the world, including fighting climate change. We need China's cooperation on that. We have hard security interests in fighting global terrorism, but we have pulled back. Our voice has been more muted. And we have lapsed into the precisely the kind of foreign policy, if I may say so, that Frank Church was fighting against. And that is a foreign policy of praising autocrats and being apathetic or even worse about our democratic allies. Then there's been the accelerating pace of globalization, which has brought both with economic integration, pretty dramatic changes in the structure of work, along with, of course, the march of technology has been doing the same. And so there's been economic dislocation, accelerating movements of people, fear of the loss of sovereignty and control. This has been a very big thing within the European Union. And of course, with more and more immigration from distant lands and cultures, more and more cultural and religious pluralism. Now, I think the great strength of democracy is its ability to absorb cultural, religious, ethnic, racial pluralism and forge e pluribus unum, out of many one. But it's a project. You got to work on it. And if you don't work on it, illiberal populism is what you get. And moreover, if people are asked, I think this is the lesson of the backlash in Germany and in Europe after the wave of immigration, particularly from Syria during the Civil War and the rise of right-wing racist parties in Europe. If you ask people to absorb too much too fast, you're going to get a backlash. This has been the history of the United States as well. So somehow you need to welcome immigration and celebrate the Statue of Liberty, but also recognize some need to regulate the flow. Then we've had, the problem of social media and the way it furthers social and political polarization by fragmenting the media spheres. So we're living in our separate information and opinion bubbles. We're not getting out of them to engage one another, to talk to one another. And by allowing and indeed encouraging the dispersion of rumor, falsehood, and outrageous, emotion-laden registration of opinion and suspicion. The problem with social media is endemic to the business model. The way that social media companies get rich is by selling ads and selling data and using data for commercial purposes. To sell more ads and to collect more user data, they need to fixate people's attention on their sites. The more time you spend on their sites, the richer they get. What fixates you on a social media site? It's some emotional connection. It could be, to some funny cat video, but very often it's to something that makes you angry, outraged, shocked. And so this is driving our political polarization in a very severe way. Then we've had the rise of Russia and China as very powerful alternatives to the United States with their malign influence. I want to come now, just in a couple of minutes of conclusion, to what we can do about all of this. I do believe strongly, it was the concluding title of my previous book, The Spirit of Democracy, that if we're going to be effective at promoting and defending democracy in the world, we've got to promote and defend democracy in our own country, and the same for our peer advanced industrial democracies. The title of that chapter was Physician, Heal Thyself. And of course, that's never been more true than now. We have to defend our democratic norms and institutions and understand that our first overarching obligation as citizens of what, with all its flaws, I still believe is the greatest democracy in the world, our first obligation is to the institutions and the norms, and not to any political party or project or leader. And therefore, we have to call out defections from democratic norms. And I'm just going to say it. This is not a partisan statement. This business of trying to get state legislatures to negate the outcome of a free and fair election and just hand over the state's electoral votes to the loser, not just of the popular vote, but of the electoral college as well, is deeply, deeply undemocratic. And were it to happen, the United States would cease to be a democracy. So unfortunately, this is a loophole in our system that could be technically seen as constitutional, although I think doing it after an election has happened is both unconstitutional and illegal. But you don't want the courts to be deciding this because it's so profoundly undemocratic in the first place. Just as trying to keep people from being able to vote in the first place is a great betrayal of a core democratic norm. So we have a lot of work to do in the United States. We did achieve as a result of a lot of hard work at the federal, state, and local level, what seems to have been the cleanest election, the smoothest election in recent US history. And I think that the reason why it was also the most participated in election in recent US history, in fact, in 120 years with the 2/3 voter turnout, is because of COVID. And a lot of people could vote at home, and that made it easier for them to vote. I could talk about a lot of the electoral reforms I think we should be thinking about that would help to depolarize our democracy. The state of Alaska, by voter initiative, just adopted one of them, which is ranked choice voting. We need to do much more to reform social media. And you can see some of the other things here that I think we need to pay attention to. So with that, I want to stop sharing my screen and take your questions and engage your comments.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That was very informative, somewhat sobering. And at this point, I think we can open this up to the audience to send in their questions. They can do that by typing them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. I will start off with a few questions, but we will try to get to as many of these as possible. And I know from experience that Larry is really good at answering questions, so I'd strongly encourage everybody to step in and ask. Let me start with one, and I think you've somewhat touched on this, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to flesh it out a little more. And it has to do with the integrity of our election process, the extent to which that has eroded over the last 15 years, and particularly with this election that we just had. How has that affected our democracy? And what do you think we should be doing to restore confidence and trust in the integrity of our elections?
Good. Well, I think that one thing we can do to restore trust and confidence in the integrity of our system of election, voting, and administration is just to look at the facts, and do this on a nonpartisan basis. There's no evidence that's been brought forward to support the charges of fraud or large-scale mischief or ill intent in the administration of the vote. And maybe it would be useful to have an independent commission like the Long Lines Commission chaired by the chief Democratic and Republican lawyers after, I think, the 2012 election, to explore things and deliver a report. But in the current era of everything being filtered through partisan media and social media outrage, Chris, I wonder how far that would get us. Let me say that I think we could use some institutional reforms. And I've been saying this for many years now because I study, Chris, how elections are administered in other countries around the world. And it is very unusual. And if you just think about it in the abstract, pretty questionable to have elected partisan officials being the administrators of elections. In 35 states in the United States or so, elected secretaries of state are the chief electoral officer of the state. And, it can raise questions if they're making decisions that the other side thinks are unfair. In most of the democracies of the world, this is a purely nonpartisan exercise. You have career civil servants who are really insulated from partisan politics. So up and down the line, I don't think we should have Republicans and Democrats in equal number or any kind of balance certifying the election results. I don't think we should have Republicans and Democrats overseeing them. I think these should be purely highly professional, well-trained civil service, neutral functions where it's like the United States Armed Forces. These people have such a deep ethic of nonpartisanship that they wouldn't think about taking one side or the other. And let me say in this regard, we could be headed in a very different direction right now if the Secretary of State of Georgia, who is one of these elected partisan secretaries of state, partisan in the sense that he ran on a party platform, had made a different decision than he did. He's a Republican. Presumably, he has political aspirations beyond being Secretary of State. The last Republican Secretary of State of Georgia is now the governor of Georgia, Brian Kemp. But this man, Raffensperger, I think is his name, said, look, I may be a Republican, said this morning, I think, I may be a Republican, but I'm also an engineer. I know how to count. I'm also a democratic citizen, and I know what the democratic process should look like. So I think we're deeply fortunate that he saw that higher obligation. But when you have partisan officials making these decisions, you don't always get that outcome.
Thanks, Larry. Just to follow up, I've received a couple questions that kind of follow on this point of the elections. And you mentioned a couple terms. One was ranked choice voting. And I note in your book, there's another term, proportional representation systems. And one of the questions is, here in Idaho, we have a supermajority of Republicans. And Republican primaries are closed. And the question is, well, first of all, maybe you could explain what these systems are that you're talking about, ranked choice voting and proportional representation systems, and how would those help to deal with a system like we have in Idaho and other states? How would that help out our election process and move it more to a democratic position?
Okay, well, let's start with ranked choice voting. In a system of ranked choice voting, you don't vote for a single candidate. If there are more than two candidates, you rank your choices: first preference, second preference, third preference. And you don't have to rank. You can just vote for a single person. If there are 5 candidates and you only want to rank 2 or 3 of them, you can do that. If nobody gets a majority of first preference votes, the candidate with the lowest number of first preference votes are eliminated. And you have what's called an instant runoff. And the person eliminated, the candidate who was eliminated, his or her votes are redistributed to the voters' second preferences. And then you see if anyone's won a majority. And if no one has, you keep going with this process of instant runoffs. Usually it only takes a second round, sometimes a third, before someone emerges as the winner. Voters are growing to like this, Chris. At the local level, it's been implemented in many cities in the United States, and it's been operating for a couple years in Maine now as well. Maine became the first state to adopt it because it gives voters more choice. And you no longer have the situation where maybe you'd like to vote for an independent or a libertarian or somebody else, but you don't want to waste your vote on a spoiler candidate, so you just vote for one of the two choices that you're given. If we had ranked choice voting, more independents would probably run. Maybe moderates who aren't likely to get their party nomination might run as independents. And it would change the race in some places, and candidates would have to reach out to a broader constituency in order to be elected. I particularly like the form of ranked choice voting that Alaska has just adopted. It's called Top 4. So this gets rid of partisan primaries, which is a big cause of our problem, because we're seeing more and more that when you have a party primary, and keep in mind, party primaries in the United States are low turnout affairs. You're lucky if you can get 20% of the voters to turn out in a party primary. So who turns out? It's the most committed, ideologically intense members of the party. So you tend to get more conservative Republicans and more liberal Democrats, and that feeds our polarization too. With Top 4, you have a blanket primary, an open primary. The top 4 candidates advance to the general election, and then you use ranked choice voting to choose between them. So again, you might have an independent, you might have a libertarian or Green Party or whatever. And if you have to win a majority of all votes with maybe a more center-leaning candidate in the race, could create a more interesting dynamic. Proportional representation happens in a multi-member district. And in that type of system, you vote by a party list, and each party gets a percentage of seats closer to its proportion of the vote. Now, since Idaho, I believe, has only 2 congressional seats, it'd be hard to do in Idaho. But in Massachusetts or Alabama, which have like 8 or 9 members of Congress, if you broke them up into 2 or 3 districts, it would mean that you'd have more Republicans elected to Congress in Massachusetts, because any number is greater than 0, which is the current number in Massachusetts, and you'd have more Democrats elected from Alabama, because you'd have more than 1. So some people see proportional representation as fair in that sense, and more inclusive.
So we've had a lot of other questions. I like this and I invite it, but many of them are focused on the election. Let me just hit on a couple other topics. One is the Electoral College, and the questions about that are kind of varied, but maybe one way to approach this is, what was the original rationale for the Electoral College? Does that rationale make sense today? And should the Electoral College be eliminated or its influence limited somehow? And if so, how?
Well, obviously there was an element of protecting states' interests, and in particular the interests of smaller states. That was one motive, but it wasn't the only one. And if you read the Federalist Papers and Alexander Hamilton's thoughts on the Electoral College in the Federalist Papers, you find, I talk about this actually in my book, that a very important motive for having the Electoral College was the fear of populism, that if there was a direct popular vote for president, that you might have a candidate who appealed to what Alexander Hamilton called the little arts of popularity, who might try and sway the people with emotion and then become a tyrant. And so our founding constitutional framers thought, if you have the indirect filtered mechanism of states choosing electors, literally an electoral college, like a college of cardinals, to choose the national leader, people who had judgment and good temperament, we would be able to avoid choosing a tyrant as our president. And this is also why we had the indirectly elected Senate, the same mechanism. The state legislatures chose the senators until we had a constitutional amendment in, I think, 1919. So you can leave it to everyone to judge how well Alexander Hamilton's philosophy was borne out in the previous election. But that was the logic, and I think it's clearly outmoded. And I think the notion that someone could win the presidency by 6 million votes and still lose the Electoral College, it's just, and by the way, you change 45,000 votes in Wisconsin, Georgia, and Arizona, and Donald Trump would have been president of the United States again, beginning in January of 2021, even with Biden winning the popular vote by 6 million votes. I don't think this is healthy for democracy, and I think it should be changed in one way or another. You could do it. We're not going to get a constitutional amendment to simply eliminate the Electoral College. I think the two best options are either the National Interstate Popular Vote Compact, where states just resolve to give their Electoral College votes to the winner of the national popular vote, or a system some are pushing now to give Electoral College votes on a proportional basis. So, you know, even down to a decimal point, if a presidential candidate gets 52.2% of the vote in the state, he or she would get 52.2% of the Electoral College votes. This would still give smaller states a little more weight in the Electoral College, and bigger states less weight in the Electoral College, but it would reduce the disparity.
So let's turn away from the elections for a minute and look at another pillar of democracy, press, a free press. And I think you alluded to this in your comments, but you know, maybe you can dial down on it a little deeper about how the rise of social media, partisan news networks, and this era of fake news has eroded confidence in our democracy and democratic institutions. And if that's the case, then what can we do about it to basically strengthen the integrity and confidence of the press and the trust in the published information?
Well, I think we need to be careful as we pursue regulation, and I think we need regulation, not to kill or excessively damage freedom of the press and freedom of expression. But I think we also need to recognize that these internet platforms are publishers now. They're not just, you know, like a telephone line or something that people are speaking over. They do carry content and inevitably make certain judgments about content. and they've got to be a little more responsible. There's some very innovative ideas coming out about what could be done, such as requiring the platforms to have a middle independent actor in between the user and, say, the Facebook platform that is vetting content and alerting people to its potentially false nature. And I think it would be better if Facebook itself didn't make these decisions. I think Facebook has taken a positive step in appointing a distinguished appeals board to hear appeals about and make decisions in disputes about the moderation of content and vetting and even eliminating content that is really hateful, insightful of violence, dangerously and patently disinforming. One of the things I'm worried about, Chris, is that as we try to regulate, we may see more gravitation toward more extremist sites or sites that have no regulation at all of extremist content. It's really an even darker internet than what we already have. I've been expecting this to happen for some time, and now we have the emergence of this with a new platform called Parler, P-A-R-L-E-R, and some others that are emerging. So the more that the big and established internet platforms vet content, the more we run the risk of driving users who have a tendency to want to have unfiltered extreme views decamp to more unfiltered, unvetted, and wild arenas of information dissemination. And so this leaves me feeling as well, not as the only policy response, but as an indispensable one, that we've got to work on people and their behavior and their patterns. And I think that education about social media and the responsible uses of it should begin in elementary school and certainly should ramp up in middle school, and that we need desperately to revive civic education more broadly. And a word that we seem to have forgotten, tolerance, and rational deliberation and respectful discourse. In this regard, I would at least like to note, I don't think we're going to have the time to get into it in detail, that at Stanford, in partnership with a non-governmental organization called Helena, we've embarked on a venture to get Americans to talk to one another about the issues that divide us in mutually respectful fashion. It's what we call a deliberative poll. And last September 2019, we brought together a random sample of 523 Americans to Dallas, Texas, to spend a weekend talking about the issues and debating them in small groups across some pretty fierce divides. We called it America in One Room. And we found that if you bring people together and give them balanced briefing papers and let them hear from opposing experts and then just let them talk to one another in a weekend in repeated conversations, moderated only to ensure civility of discourse and equal and fair participation among people around a table, you can make astonishing progress in drawing some of the poison out of our political dialogue and social relations. So if anybody's interested in this, they could just Google American One Room and get to our website and learn much more about what we've been doing in that regard.
So let's look at another branch of government, Congress. We've seen, say, over the last 15 or 20 years that Congress's power has eroded somewhat. It's certainly taken a hit on its oversight of the executive branch in recent years under the Trump administration. How has this trend, do you think, affected democracy, and what do you think could be done to restore Congress's power as a co-equal branch of government and also oversight over the executive branch?
Well, there's no problem with oversight of the executive branch when you've got an opposing political party in Congress ready to monitor, hold hearings, so on and so forth. The problem is that we have become so captive of our partisan affiliations, which have intensified to a tribal level of intensity, that it's like, a football match where the two sides line up and the ball is snapped, and then, it's just an all-out struggle. And even football matches seem to have neutral referees that we no longer have or respect very much in American democracy. So I would say the following. I think there are two reforms that I think, if you'll forgive the word, trump all others in importance, in my mind, in terms of empowering Congress to be a more effective and independent branch of government. Reform number one, I will repeat, is ranked choice voting. Why is that? Because if you had more members of Congress who felt that they could criticize, oppose, vote against, inspect, challenge, hold accountable a president of their own party, be a more independent-minded actor, and still survive politically in the next election, they would be empowered to do so. Look, I'll just state it bluntly. Why is Mitt Romney, sometimes Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins, why are they the only members of Congress to have ever really criticized, the members of the Senate, to have ever really criticized or stood up against President Trump? Well, Romney, I'll say, because I think he's an extraordinary human being, and I would, if we still had, a new version of John F. Kennedy's Profiles in Courage, I'd put him in that book. And his most recent statement decrying this exploration of an effort to steal the Electoral College, I think, is the latest manifestation of that. But who else is speaking up? It's not that they're not troubled by what they see. It's that they don't want to be defeated in a Republican primary for re-election when President Trump sends out a tweet endorsing their opponent. So if we had ranked choice voting, and if we eliminated the sore loser rule, which says that if you lose your party primary, you can't run for the general election, then they would be emboldened to be more independent, because they would have a path to re-election, even being more independent. Or if you had the new Alaska system of top four and then ranked choice voting, it'd be the same thing. They know, even if they, even if there's a Republican who challenges them, they'd get supports from some Democrats and independents, or if you're a Democrat, from some Republicans and independents, and they'd fare okay with ranked choice voting in the general election. The second reform, Chris, is we have to diminish the power of the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader to control the agenda. There's been some progress on this in the House. There's been no progress on this in the Senate. And the Senate Majority Leader, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican, should not have the absolute personal power to decide what gets to the floor of the body. And so you should be able to bring a bill to the floor, even if the Senate Majority Leader doesn't like it, if it's got some demonstrated breadth of bipartisan support.
Those are good suggestions. Here's a question that we got from somebody just a moment ago. It has to do with promoting democracy abroad and the importance of that. And the question is this still a useful exercise for the U.S.? Has the U.S. lost its platform to preach its merits?
I think it's not only useful, I think it's vital. And one of the things you'll all be interested to know is that even in the midst of all our political polarization and all of this kind of erosion of America's voice for human rights and democracy around the world, the Congress dramatically increased funding for our principal instrument of democracy promotion around the world, which is the independent but congressionally funded National Endowment for Democracy. And last fall 2019, the Congress voted a 60% increase in funding for the National Endowment for Democracy. And the bipartisan commitment to having the US support independent civil society organizations, independent media, trade unions, business associations, to strengthen democratic political parties, legislatures, courts, and so on. The support for this across party lines in the US is very strong. And so these are things that, you know, we know how to do, and they can really make a difference to Democrats and human rights activists who are struggling around the world. I think that people are hungry to see the US back in the game of defending human rights and democratic principles around the world. I think the challenge now going forward is twofold. Number one, we've got to show we're serious about addressing our own democratic deficits internally. And number two, while we do that and re-engage on the international stage, obviously we need to do so with a little bit more humility, recognizing that we're all flawed democracies and we all have work to do to improve and strengthen democratic values and institutions. And I think we can do that.
So we have time for just a couple more questions, maybe. Let me switch to the third branch of our government, the judiciary and the legal system. Have you seen an over-politicization of the legal system and the judicial systems in our country in the past several decades and maybe in the past few years? And if so, how has that affected our democracy and the rule of law, and what can be done to fix that?
Well, there's no question that the judiciary has become too politicized, and especially the Supreme Court. And I think there's a very straightforward fix for partial fix for the over-politicization of the Supreme Court. And that is term limits. It is, I think, extremely perverse, particularly in an era when people are both living longer, but also remaining intellectually sharp much longer. It's really perverse that Supreme Court justices have lifetime appointments. There's no other advanced industrial democracy that lets people sit on their constitutional courts for 40 years, which is what we're beginning to look at now, I think, because presidents in their vanity not only want to appoint a justice that will be in the political image of their beliefs or their constituency, but they want to shape the court for decades to come. So they're appointing younger and younger justices, with Justice Coney Barrett being the most dramatic example. And so The Economist magazine had a proposal some months ago that I had previously endorsed in my book, and that many others are gravitating to, of an 18-year term limit for Supreme Court justices. That's still a pretty generous amount of time. And if you allowed that they could then rotate off the Supreme Court, but remain on the federal bench, it seems that it would not require a constitutional amendment. You could just stipulate that they would be appointed to the federal bench for life, but to the Supreme Court only for 18 years. And then you would stipulate that in the first and third year of every presidential term, a president would get to name a new Supreme Court justice. And then you've got these terms. It's kind of like the Federal Reserve, and people would rotate off, and then new ones would be appointed. So this is what I would favor. And, you know, it would take some of the hysteria out of this. They're not going to be there forever. It's an 18-year term. And if you are, from one party and you're worried the president's gotten an opportunity to name justices, well, if you get the presidency in the next election, you'll have 2 Supreme Court appointments as well. Now, there's some complexities about how, and debates about how you phase this in, but I think that's what we should be looking toward.
Okay.
I would also favor more nonpartisan vetting and more nonpartisan participation in the selection of all federal judicial appointments.
This takes it down to more of a local level, and which is how most of us experience our democracy. How can we help people better understand democracy as a practical activity in our communities?
What a great question. Well, I would say, I guess I'll close where I was a little bit earlier, that we have to shape and nurture democratic citizenship. I just can't emphasize this more passionately enough. The phenomenon of civic education, I find, has eroded across our democracy. You know, Chris, we're from more or less the same generation, and I don't know about you, but civics was very important when I was growing up, and starting in elementary school, by the way, on the importance of elections in school, and watching I watched the 1960 Democratic and Republican national conventions and the Nixon-Kennedy debates. It had a very important impact on me. But we need to get young people not only to watch and engage in our political process and to model citizenship and to be involved with city councils and so on, but we need to preach tolerance, mutual respect, listening, and deliberation. So we are actually taking this model of deliberation and dialogue among people who come and are briefed on the issues and listen to experts and then talk to one another in small groups. And we're bringing it to the school systems now through the Center for Deliberative Democracy at Stanford University. So I think trying to work this in at an early age and maybe having cities and communities use deliberative polling as an advisory mechanism for making decisions and bridging our social and political differences would be a very positive thing. But if we don't work on democratic citizenship as both participation and mutual respect and restraint, our democracy is going to be in very serious trouble. And that is something that nurturing and development of active but mutually respectful and tolerant democratic citizenship is something that every community can cultivate and nurture.
Incredible, Larry. I want to thank you so much. I think we're running out of time. And I would just state that we will probably have this presentation posted on our Fridays with Frank website. So if anybody wants to review it again, they're certainly welcome to do that. And on behalf of the entire board of directors of the Frank Church Institute, Garry Wenske, executive director, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be with you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for everybody for joining us. Just let you know that we have another session this afternoon. It's still going. It starts at 1 p.m. It's a great panel discussion on the subject of cybersecurity and its impact and influence on democracy. So we invite everybody else to join with us at that time also. Thank you.